Stand-Up Historian. Those who tell stories rule society.
Hello and welcome to Standup Historian. My name is Kurosh and I bring this show to you from beautiful Seattle, Washington. In this edition of Standup Historian, I want to tell you a story of occupation by a foreign power and a story of a war. The two countries involved in this war are very familiar, especially the occupied country, because just about a little less than a year ago, the United States forces left this country hastily and without any organization, and in fact in a very disastrous manner. Yes, I'm talking about Afghanistan. United States obviously was not the first country to invade Afghanistan. Over its history, Afghanistan has been invaded so many times by different powers of the time. This small, mountainous, landlocked country in Central and South Asia has been invaded so many times, from Alexander the Great forces to Persian empires to Rashidun Caliphates and Mongol Empire, and you name it. Everybody invaded Afghanistan, including British Empire. And this is the story of the first war between British forces and Afghans. British invasion of Afghanistan in 1838 to 1842 ended in total disaster, and in fact completely obliterated British forces in Afghanistan. So this is the story of Afghans' resistance and war against occupying forces of Britain. Just to give you a picture of what was going on at the time, Britain controls India, the crown jewel of its empire. And they're always concerned that maybe Russians during this time, which is called Great Game, Russians may want to make a move on India, and the best way for them would have been through Afghanistan. So they need to make sure that Afghanistan is not available for Russians for any possible invasion of India. So these two empires vied for dominance in Central Asia during the 19th century. And as I mentioned before, it was called the Great Game. The Russian Empire moved south while the British Empire moved north from its so-called crown jewel, colonial India. Their interests collide in Afghanistan. And that is where the First Anglo-Afghan War happened. And a British incursion into Afghanistan ended in total disaster in 1842, while retreating back to India was massacred. Let's get on with this story and tell you this. But before I tell you this story, remember that every time you try to find historical stories, it is very hard to find equal amount of information from both sides, almost impossible. And of course, contradicting information. In case of a country like Afghanistan, you can hardly come up with any information. How many historians in Afghanistan wrote the history of their wars? It's mostly oral history. People tell the story to their children and their children to their children. So what sources are available are mostly Western sources and obviously dominantly British sources. I tried to create a balance here to figure out actually what really happened. But at the end, I leave the judgment to you. Okay. Both British and Russians approached Afghanistan Amir at the time, which was Dost Muhammad Khan, and hoping to form an alliance with him. Britain's Governor General of India, George Eden, also known as Lord Auckland, grew extremely concerned when he heard that a Russian envoy had arrived in Kabul in 1838. His agitation increased when talks broke down between the Afghan ruler and the Russians, signaling the possibility of a Russian invasion. Before I go further, let me just remind you that Russia invaded Afghanistan and more than once. Probably you've heard of Russian invasion of 1979, which took 10 years until 1989, where Mikhail Gorbachev pulled the forces of former Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. So what happens in any of these countries are nothing new. Anyways, Lord Auckland decided to strike first to forestall a Russian attack. And he justified this approach in a document known as the Simla Manifesto of October 1839. In his manifesto, it states that to secure quote-unquote trustworthy ally to the west of British India, British troops would enter Afghanistan to support Shah Shuja. So there was two factions fighting over the control of Afghanistan, one under Dost Muhammad Khan and the other one was Shah Shuja. And British forces, they want to take side with Shah Shuja and help to install him. And support Shah Shuja in his attempts to retake the throne from Dost Muhammad. According to Auckland, the British were not invading Afghanistan, just helping out a deposed friend to prevent quote-unquote foreign interferences. All these pretexts and all these excuses are very, very familiar. Anyways, in December of 1838, a British East India Company force of 21,000, mainly Indian troops, began to march northwest from Punjab. Again, British East India Company forces, corporations. They crossed the mountains in the dead of winter, arriving at Quetta in Afghanistan in March of 1839. The British easily captured Quetta and Kandahar and then routed Dost Muhammad's army in July. The Amir fled to Bukhara through Bamiyan, and the British reinstalled Shah Shuja on the throne 30 years after he had lost it to Dost Muhammad. So British forces, which are from British East India Company, 21,000 of them, they get involved in this conflict of powers in Afghanistan. They support one side, they help Shah Shuja to take control of the country, and in fact they install a puppet in that country. Well satisfied, and this was very easy victory for British. The British withdrew, and they just left 6,000 troops to prop up Shuja's newly installed regime. Dost Muhammad, however, was not ready to give up so easily. And in 1840, a year after Shuja was installed, he mounted a counterattack from Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan. The British had to rush reinforcement back into Afghanistan, and they managed to capture Dus Muhammad and brought him to India as a prisoner. In fact, in the second attempt, Dus Muhammad was captured and sent to India, and the British now, they know that, okay, our puppet, Shuja Khan, in Afghanistan is safe and sound. Dus Muhammad's son, Muhammad Akbar, began to rally Afghan fighters to his side in the summer and autumn of 1841 from his base in Bamiyan. Afghanistan is a very tribal country. Very strong religious beliefs, very strong tribal ties, and many of these names that you hear in stories, like here Dus Muhammad Khan, when his son comes and asks for Afghan fighters to support him, he always gets an answer from them. Afghan discontent with the continued presence of foreign troops mounted, leading to the assassination of Captain Alexander Burns and his aides in Kabul on November 2nd, 1841. So between 1939 and November of 1841, so much happened in Afghanistan. Wars and conflicts, and British, they are trying to keep this regime in place with Shah Shuja at the head of that. But after the Captain Alexander Burns was killed, the British did not retaliate against the mob that killed the captain in fear of encouraging further attention and further anti-British actions. Meanwhile, in an effort to soothe his angry subjects, Shah Shuja, the puppet, made the fateful decision that he no longer needed British support. Just a general idea to understand. Most countries on the East, they enjoy a sense of nationalism. They are very noble and kind people, but they do not accept foreign forces to come and tell them what to do and what not to do. Anyways, Shah Shuja knew that his people, they don't like to see British forces in their country supporting their so-called emir. So he said, guys, I don't need you, you leave. And then General William Elphinstone and 16,000 British and Indian troops on Afghanistan soil agreed to begin their withdrawal from Kabul in 1842. As they made their way through the winter-bound mountains towards Jalalabad on January 5th, a contingent of Ghilzai or Pashtun warriors attacked the ill-prepared British lines. Shah Shuja asks the British to take your forces. I'm fine here. Your presence here is what causes the problems. British accept to leave, and over 16,000 British forces, British troops, withdrawing from Afghanistan. This is the picture we're looking at, until Pashtun warriors attack them. The British East India troops were strung out along the mountain path, struggling through 2 feet of snow. Winters in Afghanistan are horrible. Extreme cold, lot of snow, and mostly dry cold, which, burns to the bone. In the fight that followed, the Afghans killed almost all of the British and Indian soldiers and camp followers. a small handful was taken prisoner. It is said that there was only one person left alive from the entire British troops, and that was British Dr. William Brydon. He famously managed to ride his injured horse through the mountains and report the disaster to British authorities in Jalalabad. He and 8 captured prisoners were the only ethnic British survivors of about 700 who set out from Kabul. So what's noteworthy here is there was only 700 ethnic British forces among the 16,000. So all those other people that they were slaughtered are Indians and other nations that the great British Empire uses and British East India Company uses to do their dirty jobs. 700 British. The rest are not native British. Just a few months after the massacre of Elphinstone's army, by the way, this happened by the Muhammad Akbar's forces, which is the son of Dost Muhammad. And Dost Muhammad, remember, British removed him and installed Shah Shuja. The new leader's agents assassinated Shah Shuja. So not only they massacred British forces, they also killed their puppet Amir. Now, Queen Victoria is the Queen of England at the time, and she was furious when she heard the news. And furious about the massacre of their Kabul garrison, the British East India Company troops in Peshawar and Kandahar marched on Kabul, rescuing several British prisoners and burning down the Great Bazaar in retaliation. This further enraged the Afghans, who set aside ethno-linguistic differences, tribal differences, and became one nation and united to drive the British out of their capital city. This has happened every time these foreign forces tried to enforce what they want to this nation, to Afghans. During the invasion of Soviet Union, all different factions, regardless of their language and their religion in Afghanistan, united, and with a lot of support from the United States, they in fact pushed out Soviet military, and they were known as Red Army. But they could not stand and resist against Afghans. And it was Afghans that at the end came out victor. Lord Auckland, remember, he is the British who decided to preemptively invade Afghanistan and put a friendly character to run that country to stop Russians. Next, concocted a plan to storm Kabul with a much larger force and establish permanent British rule there. However, he had a stroke in 1842 and was replaced as Governor General of India by Edward Law, or Lord Ellenborough, who had a mandate to restore peace to Asia. Lord Ellenborough released Dost Muhammad from prison in Calcutta without a string attached, without any condition, and the Afghan emir retook his throne in Kabul. Let's just for a second think about this story. British forces preemptively invade Afghanistan, remove Dost Muhammad as the emir, as the ruler of that country, install someone. War breaks out, British defeated in this war, and they bring back Dost Muhammad Khan back to power. Fast forward to 2001. United States of America invades Afghanistan, not alone, with British forces, Australian forces, and others. They remove Taliban. 20 years later, they leave Afghanistan, and Talibans come back and take control of that country again. We better learn from history, otherwise we're condemned to repeat it. Anyways, a magazine based in Boston, the North American Review, published a remarkably extensive and timely account titled "The English in Afghanistan," 6 months after the defeat of British forces in July of 1842. And it contained this vivid description. On the 6th of January 1842, the Kabul forces commenced their retreat through the Dismal Pass, destined to be their grave. On the third day, were attacked by the mountaineers from all points, and a fearful slaughter ensued. The troops kept on, and awful scenes ensued. Without food, mangled and cut to pieces, each one caring only for himself. All subordination had fled, and the soldiers of the 44th English Regiment are reported to have knocked down their officers with the butts of their muskets. On the 13th of January, just 7 days after the retreat commenced, one man, bloody and torn, mounted on a miserable pony and pursued by horsemen, was seen riding furiously across the plains of Jalalabad. That was Dr. Brydon, the sole person to tell the tale of passage of Horde Kabul. More than 16,000 people had set out to retreat from Kabul, and in the end, only one man, Dr. William Brydon, a British Army surgeon, had made it alive to Jalalabad. The garrison there lit signal fires and sounded bugles to guide other British survivors to safety. But after several days, they realized the Brydon would be the only one. The legend of the sole survivor endured. In the 1870s, a British painter by the name of Elizabeth Thompson, or Lady Butler, produced a dramatic painting of a soldier on a dying horse, said to be based on the story of Brydon. The painting, titled Remnants of an Army, is in the collection of the Tate Gallery in London. The loss of so many troops to mountain tribesmen of Afghanistan was, of course, a bitter humiliation for the British force. With Kabul lost, a campaign was mounted to evacuate the rest of British troops from garrisons in Afghanistan, and the British then withdrew from the country entirely. Another interesting story, another interesting twist into this story is, while popular legend held that Dr. Brydon was the only survivor from the horrific retreat from Kabul, some British troops and their wives had been taken hostage by Afghans and were later rescued or released. A few other survivors turned up over the years as well. One account in A History of Afghanistan by former British diplomat Sir Martin Evans contends that in the 1920s, two elderly women in Kabul were introduced to British diplomats. Astoundingly, they had been on the retreat as babies. They must have been in their 80s when in 1920s they were presented to the British diplomats. Their British parents had apparently been killed, but they had been rescued and brought up by Afghan families. So right here you start to think, if Afghans, if they massacred everybody in that retreat, and if we believe that they killed women and children and everybody, how could survivors like this turn up many years later? Despite the 1842 disaster, the British did not abandon the hope of controlling Afghanistan. And the Second Anglo-Afghan War of 1878 to 1880 finally secured a diplomatic solution that kept Russian influence out of Afghanistan for the remainder of the 19th century. Before I close this, let's see what was the consequences of this first war. Following this great victory over the British, Afghanistan maintained its independence and continued to play the two European powers off of each other for 3 more decades. In the meantime, the Russians conquered much of Central Asia up to the Afghanistan border, seizing what is now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. The people of what is now Turkmenistan were the last vanquished by the Russians at the Battle of Geyuktepe in 1881. Alarmed by the Tsar's expansionism, Britain kept a wary eye on India's northern borders. In 1878, they, as I said before, invaded Afghanistan once again, sparkling the Second Anglo-Afghan War. As for the people of Afghanistan, the first war with the British reconfirmed their distrust of foreign powers and their intense dislike of foreign troops on Afghanistan soil. Didn't they prove it again in 21st century? British Army chaplain Reverend G.R. Gligg wrote in 1843 that the First Anglo-Afghan War was begun for no wise purpose, carried on with a strange mixture of rashness and timidity, and brought to a close after suffering and disaster, without much glory attached either to the government which directed or the great body of troops which waged it. It seems safe to assume that Dost Muhammad and his son Muhammad Akbar and most Afghan people were much better pleased by the outcome. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Stand-Up Historian. And before I close, I like to read this short passage for you by William Hay McNaughton, which was the general in that first Afghan war. From Mokur to Khyber Pass, all is content and tranquility. And wherever we Europeans go, we are received with respect, attention, and welcome. I think our prospects are most cheering. Thank you, and have a good night.